The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Life cannot stop because tragedy enters it. Meals must be made ready, though a son dies, and porches must be repaired, even if your only daughter is going out of her mind. Mrs. Frederick, in her systematic way, had long ago appointed the second week in June for the repairing of the front porch, the roof of which was sagging dangerously. Roaring Abel had been engaged to do it many moons before, and Roaring Abel promptly appeared on the morning of the first day of the second week, and fell to work. Of course, he was drunk. Roaring Abel was never anything but drunk, but he was only in the first stage, which made him talkative and genial. The odor of whiskey on his breath nearly drove Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles wild at dinner. Even Valancy, with all her emancipation, did not like it. But she liked Abel, and she liked his vivid, eloquent talk, and after she washed the dinner dishes, she went out and sat on the steps and talked to him. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles thought it a terrible proceeding, but what could they do? Valancy only smiled mockingly at them when they called her in, and did not go. It was so easy to defy once you got started. The first step was the only one that really counted. They were both afraid to say anything more to her, lest she might make a scene before Roaring Abel, who would spread it all over the country with his own characteristic comments and exaggerations. It was too cold a day, in spite of the June sunshine, for Mrs. Frederick to sit at the dining room window and listen to what was said. She had to shut the window, and Valancy and Roaring Abel had their talk to themselves. But if Mrs. Frederick had known what the outcome of that talk was to be, she would have prevented it if the porch was never repaired. Valancy sat on the steps, defiant of the chill breeze of this cold June, which had made Aunt Isabel aver the seasons were changing. She did not care whether she caught a cold or not. It was delightful to sit there in that cold, beautiful, fragrant world and feel free. She filled her lungs with the clean, lovely wind, and held out her arms to it and let it tear her hair to pieces while she listened to Roaring Abel, who told her his troubles between intervals of hammering gaily in time to his Scottish songs. Valancy liked to hear him. Every stroke of his hammer fell true to the note. Old Abel Gay, in spite of his 70 years, was handsome still, in a stately, patriarchal manner. His tremendous beard, falling down over his blue flannel shirt, was still a flaming, untouched red, though his shock of hair was white as snow, and his eyes were a fiery, youthful blue. His enormous, reddish-white eyebrows were more like mustaches than eyebrows. Perhaps this is why he always kept his upper lip scrupulously shaved. His cheeks were red, and his nose ought to have been, but wasn't. It was a fine, upstanding, aquiline nose, such as the noblest Roman of them all might have rejoiced in. Abel was 6'2" in his stockings, broad-shouldered, lean-hipped. In his youth he had been a famous lover, finding all women too charming to bind himself to one. His years had been a wild, colorful panorama of follies and adventures, gallantries, fortunes, and misfortunes. He had been 45 before he married, a pretty slip of a girl, whom his goings-on killed in a few years. Abel was piously drunk at her funeral, and insisted on repeating the 55th chapter of Isaiah. Abel knew most of the Bible, and all of the Psalms by heart, while the minister, whom he disliked, prayed or tried to pray. Thereafter his house was run by an untidy old cousin, who cooked his meals and kept things going after a fashion. In this unpromising environment, little Cecilia Gay had grown up. Valancy had known Sissy Gay fairly well in the democracy of the public school, though Sissy had been 3 years younger than she. After they left school, their paths diverged, and she had seen nothing of her. Old Abel was a Presbyterian. That is, he got a Presbyterian preacher to marry him, baptize his child, and bury his wife, and he knew more about Presbyterian theology than most ministers, which made him a terror to them in arguments. But Roaring Abel never went to church. Every Presbyterian minister who had been in Deerwood had tried his hand, once, at reforming Roaring Abel, but he had not been pestered of late. Reverend Mr. Bentley had been in Deerwood for 8 years, but he had not sought out Roaring Abel since the first 3 months of his pastorate. He had called on Roaring Abel then, and found him in the theological state of drunkenness, which always followed the sentimental maudlin one and preceded the roaring, blasphemous one. The eloquently prayerful one, in which he realized himself temporarily and intensely as a sinner in the hands of an angry God, was the final one. Abel never went beyond it. He generally fell asleep on his knees and awakened sober, but he had never been dead drunk in his life. He told Mr. Bentley that he was a sound Presbyterian and sure of his election. He had no sins, that he knew of, to repent of. "Have you ever done anything in your life that you are sorry for?" asked Mr. Bentley. Roaring Abel scratched his bushy white head and pretended to reflect. "Well, yes," he said finally. "There were some women I might have kissed and didn't. I've always been sorry for that." Mr. Bentley went out and went home. Abel had seen that Sissy was properly baptized, jovially drunk at the same time himself. He made her go to church and Sunday school regularly. The church people took her up, and she was in turn a member of the mission band, the Girls' Guild, and the Young Women's Missionary Society. She was a faithful, unobtrusive, sincere little worker. Everybody liked Sissy Gay, and was sorry for her. She was so modest and sensitive, and pretty in that delicate, elusive fashion of beauty which fades so quickly if life is not kept in it by love and tenderness. But then liking and pity did not prevent them from tearing her in pieces like hungry cats when the catastrophe came. 4 years previously, Sissy Gay had gone up to a Muskoka hotel as a summer waitress, and when she had come back in the fall, she was a changed creature. She hid herself away and went nowhere. The reason soon leaked out, and scandal raged. That winter, Sissy's baby was born. Nobody ever knew who the father was. Cecily kept her poor, pale lips tightly locked on her sorry secret. Nobody dared ask Roaring Abel any questions about it. Rumor and surmise laid the guilt at Barney Snaith's door because diligent inquiry among the other maids at the hotel revealed the fact that nobody there had ever seen Sissy Gay with a fellow. She had kept to herself, they said, rather resentfully. Too good for our dances, and now look. The baby had lived for a year. After its death, Sissy faded away. 2 years ago, Dr. Marsh had given her only 6 months to live. Her lungs were hopelessly diseased, but she was still alive. Nobody went to see her. Women would not go to Roaring Abel's house. Mr. Bentley had gone once, when he knew Abel was away, but the dreadful old creature who was scrubbing the kitchen floor told him Sissy wouldn't see anyone. The old cousin had died, and Roaring Abel had 2 or 3 disreputable housekeepers, the only kind who could be prevailed on to go to a house where a girl was dying of consumption. But the last one had left, and Roaring Abel had now no one to wait on Sissy and do for him. This wasn't the burden of his plaint to Valancy, and he condemned the hypocrites of Deerwood and its surrounding communities with some rich, meaty oaths that happened to reach Cousin Stickles's ears as she passed through the hall and nearly finished the poor lady. Was Valancy listening to that? Valancy hardly noticed the profanity. Her attention was focused on the horrible thought of poor, unhappy, disgraced little Sissy Gay, ill and helpless in that forlorn old house out on Mistowis Road, without a soul to help or comfort her. And this in a nominally Christian community in the year of grace 19 and some odd. Do you mean to say that Sissy is all alone there now, with nobody to do anything for her? Nobody? Oh, she can move about a bit and get a bite and sup when she wants it, but she can't work. It's D hard for a man to work hard all day and go home at night tired and hungry and cook his own meals. Sometimes I'm sorry I kicked old Rachel Edwards out. Abel described Rachel picturesquely. Her face looked as if it had wore out 100 bodies, and she moped. Talk about temper. Temper's nothing to mopin'. She was too slow to catch worms, and dirty, dirty. I ain't unreasonable. I know a man has to eat his peck before he dies, but she went over the limit. What'd you suppose I saw that lady do? She made some pumpkin jam, had it on the table in glass jars with the tops off. The dog got up on the table and stuck his paw into one of them. What'd she do? She just took holt of the dog and wrung the syrup off his paw back into the jar. then screw the top on and set it in the pantry. I sets open the door and says to her, 'Go.' The dame went, and I fired the jars of punkin after her, 2 at a time. Thought I'd die laughing to see old Rachel run with them punkin jars raining after her. She's told everywhere I'm crazy, so nobody'll come for love or money." "But Sissy must have someone to look after her," insisted Valancy, whose mind was centered on this aspect of the case. She did not care whether Roaring Abel had anyone to cook for him or not, but her heart was wrung for Cecilia Gay. "Oh, she gets on. Barney Snaith always drops in when he's passing, and does anything she wants done. Brings her oranges and flowers and things. There's a Christian for you. Yet that sanctimonious, sniveling parcel of St. Andrew's people wouldn't be seen on the same side of the road with him. Their dogs will go to heaven before they do. And their minister? Slick as if the cat had licked him." "There are plenty of good people, both in St. Andrew's and St. George's, who would be kind to Sissy if you would behave yourself," said Valancy severely. "They're afraid to go near your place." "Because I'm such a sad old dog? But I don't bite. Never bit anyone in my life. A few loose words spilled around don't hurt anyone. And I'm not asking people to come. Don't want 'em poking and prying about. What I want is a housekeeper. If I shaved every Saturday and went to church, I'd get all the housekeepers I'd want. I'd be respectable then. But what's the use of going to church when it's all settled by predestination? Tell me that, miss." "Is it?" said Valancy. "Yes. Can't get around it nohow. Wish I could. I don't want either heaven or hell for steady. Wish a man could have 'em mixed in equal proportions." "Isn't that the way it is in this world?" said Valancy thoughtfully, but rather as if her thought was concerned with something else than theology. "No, no," boomed Abel, striking a tremendous blow on a stubborn nail. "There's too much hell here. Entirely too much hell. That's why I get drunk so often. It sets you free for a little while. Free from yourself. Yes, by God, free from predestination. Ever try it?" "No, I've another way of getting free," said Valancy absently. "But about Sissy now. She must have someone to look after her." "What are you harping on Sis for? Seems to me you ain't bothered much about her up to now. You never even come to see her. And she used to like you so well." "I should have," said Valancy. "But never mind. You couldn't understand. The point is, you must have a housekeeper." "Where am I to get one? I can pay decent wages if I could get a decent woman. D'you think I like old hags?" "Will I do?" said Valancy. End of chapter 14.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 15. "Let us be calm," said Uncle Benjamin. "Let us be perfectly calm." "Calm?" Mrs. Frederick wrung her hands. "How can I be calm? How could anybody be calm under such a disgrace as this?" "Why in the world did you let her go?" asked Uncle James. "Let her? How could I stop her, James? It seems she packed the big valise and sent it away with Roaring Abel when he went home after supper, while Christine and I were out in the kitchen. Then Doss herself came down with her little satchel, dressed in her green serge suit. I felt a terrible premonition. I can't tell you how it was, but I seemed to know that Doss was going to do something dreadful." "It's a pity you couldn't have had your premonition a little sooner," said Uncle Benjamin dryly. I said, "Doss, where are you going?" And she said, "I am going to look for my blue castle." "Wouldn't you think that would convince Marsh that her mind is affected?" interjected Uncle James. And I said, "Valancy, what do you mean?" And she said, "I am going to keep house for Roaring Abel and Nurse Sissy. He will pay me $30 a month." I wonder I didn't drop dead on the spot. "You shouldn't have let her go. You shouldn't have let her out of the house," said Uncle James. "You should have locked the door, anything. She was between me and the front door, and you can't realize how determined she was. She was like a rock. That's the strangest thing of all about her. She used to be so good and obedient, and now she's neither to hold nor bind. But I said everything I could think of to bring her to her senses. I asked her if she had no regard for her reputation. I said to her solemnly, 'Doss, when a woman's reputation is once smirched, nothing can ever make it spotless again. Your character will be gone forever if you go to Roaring Abel's to wait on a bad girl like Sis Gay.' And she said, 'I don't believe Sissy was a bad girl, but I don't care if she was.' Those were her very words. 'I don't care if she was.'" She has lost all sense of decency, exploded Uncle Benjamin. Sissy Gay is dying, she said, and it's a shame and disgrace that she is dying in a Christian community with no one to do anything for her. Whatever she's been or done, she's a human being. Well, when it comes to that, I suppose she is, said Uncle James with the air of one making a splendid concession. I asked Doss if she had no regard for appearances. She said, I've been keeping up appearances all my life. Now I'm going in for realities. Appearances can go hang. Go hang! An outrageous thing, said Uncle Benjamin violently. An outrageous thing. Which relieved his feelings, but didn't help anyone else. Mrs. Frederick wept. Cousin Stickles took up the refrain between her moans of despair. We both told her, that Roaring Abel had certainly killed his wife in one of his drunken rages and would kill her. She laughed and said, I'm not afraid of Roaring Abel. He won't kill me, and he's too old for me to be afraid of his gallantries. What did she mean? What are gallantries? Mrs. Frederick saw that she must stop crying if she wanted to regain control of the conversation. I said to her, Valancy, if you have no regard for your own reputation and your family's standing, have you none for my feelings? She said none. Just like that. None. Insane people never do have any regard for other people's feelings, said Uncle Benjamin. That's one of the symptoms. I broke out into tears then, and she said, Come now, mother, be a good sport. I'm going to do an act of Christian charity, and as for the damages it will do to my reputation, why, I haven't any matrimonial chances anyhow, so what does it matter? And with that she turned and went out. The last words I said to her, said Cousin Stickles pathetically, were, Who will rub my back at nights now? And she said, but no, I cannot repeat it. Nonsense, said Uncle Benjamin, out with it. This is no time to be squeamish. She said, Cousin Stickles's voice was little more than a whisper. She said, Oh, darn. To think I should have lived to hear my daughter swearing, sobbed Mrs. Frederick. It was only imitation swearing, faltered Cousin Stickles, desirous of smoothing things over now that the worst was out. But she had never told about the banister. It will be only a step from that to real swearing, said Uncle James sternly. The worst of this, Mrs. Frederick hunted for a dry spot on her handkerchief, is that everyone will know now that she is deranged. We can't keep it a secret any longer. Oh, I cannot bear it. You should have been stricter when she was young, said Uncle Benjamin. I don't see how I could have been, said Mrs. Frederick, truthfully enough. The worst feature of the case is that Snaith scoundrel is always hanging around Roaring Abel, said Uncle James. I shall be thankful if nothing worse comes of this mad freak than a few weeks at Roaring Abel's. Sissy Gay can't live much longer. And she didn't even take her flannel petticoat, lamented Cousin Stickles. I'll see Ambrose Marsh again about this, said Uncle Benjamin, meaning Valancy, not the flannel petticoat. I'll see Lawyer Ferguson, said Uncle James. Meanwhile, added Uncle Benjamin, let us be calm. End of chapter 15.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 16. Valancy had walked out to Roaring Abel's house on the Mistowis Road under a sky of purple and amber, with a queer exhilaration and expectancy in her heart. Back there, behind her, her mother and Cousin Stickles were crying, over themselves, not over her. But here the wind was in her face, soft, dew-wet, cool, blowing along the grassy roads. Oh, she loved the wind. The robins were whistling sleepily in the firs along the way, and the moist air was fragrant with the tang of balsam. Big cars went purring past in the violet dusk. The stream of summer tourists to Muskoka had already begun, but Valancy did not envy any of their occupants. Muskoka cottages might be charming, but beyond, in the sunset skies, among the spires of the firs, her blue castle towered. She brushed the old years and habits and inhibitions away from her like dead leaves. She would not be littered with them. Roaring Abel's rambling, tumble-down old house was situated about 3 miles from the village, on the very edge of up-back, as the sparsely settled, hilly, wooded country around Mistowis was called vernacularly. It did not, it must be confessed, look much like a blue castle. It had once been a snug place enough in the days when Abel Gay had been young and prosperous, and the punning, arched sign over the gate, A. Gay, Carpenter, had been fine and freshly painted. Now it was a faded, dreary old place, with a leprous patched roof and shutters hanging askew. Abel never seemed to do any carpenter jobs about his own house. It had a listless air, as if tired of life. There was a dwindling grove of ragged, crone-like old spruces behind it. The garden, which Sissy used to keep neat and pretty, had run wild. On two sides of the house were fields full of nothing but malins. Behind the house was a long stretch of useless barrens, full of scrub pines and spruces, with here and there a blossoming bit of wild cherry, running back to a belt of timber on the shores of Lake Mistowis, 2 miles away. A rough, rocky, boulder-strewn lane ran through it to the woods, a lane white with pestiferous, beautiful daisies. Roaring Abel met Valancy at the door. "So you've come," he said incredulously. "I never supposed that ruck of Sterlings would let you." Valancy showed all her pointed teeth in a grin. "They couldn't stop me." "I didn't think you'd so much spunk," said Roaring Abel admiringly. "And look at the nice ankles of her," he added as he stepped aside to let her in. If Cousin Stickles had heard this, she would have been certain that Valancy's doom, earthly and unearthly, was sealed. But Abel's superannuated gallantry did not worry Valancy. Besides, this was the first compliment she had ever received in her life, and she found herself liking it. She sometimes suspected she had nice ankles, but nobody had ever mentioned it before. In the Sterling clan, ankles were among the unmentionables. Roaring Abel took her into the kitchen, where Sissy Gay was lying on the sofa, breathing quickly, with little scarlet spots on her hollow cheeks. Valancy had not seen Cecilia Gay for years. Then she had been such a pretty creature, a slight blossom-like girl with soft golden hair, clear-cut, almost waxen features, and large, beautiful blue eyes. She was shocked at the change in her. Could this be sweet Sissy, this pitiful little thing that looked like a tired broken flower? She had wept all the beauty out of her eyes. They looked too big, enormous, in her wasted face. The last time Valancy had seen Cecilia Gay, those faded, piteous eyes had been limpid, shadowy blue pools aglow with mirth. The contrast was so terrible that Valancy's own eyes filled with tears. She knelt down by Sissy and put her arms about her. "Sissy, dear, I've come to look after you. I'll stay with you till, as long as you want me." "Oh!" Sissy put her thin arms about Valancy's neck. "Oh, will you? It's been so lonely. I can wait on myself, but it's been so lonely. It would be just like heaven to have someone here like you. You are always so sweet to me long ago." Valancy held Sissy close. She was suddenly happy. Here was someone who needed her, someone she could help. She was no longer a superfluity. Old things had passed away. Everything had become new. "Most things are predestinated, but some are just darn sheer luck," said Roaring Abel, complacently smoking his pipe in the corner. End of chapter 16.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery, Chapter 17. When Valancy had lived for a week at Roaring Abel's, She felt as if years had separated her from her old life and all the people she had known in it. They were beginning to seem remote, dreamlike, far away, and as the days went on, they seemed more so, until they ceased to matter altogether. She was happy. Nobody ever bothered her with conundrums or insisted on giving her purple pills. Nobody called her Doss or worried her about catching cold. There were no quilts to piece, no abominable rubber plant to water, no ice-cold maternal tantrums to endure. She could be alone whenever she liked, go to bed when she liked, sneeze when she liked. In the long, wondrous northern twilights, when Sissy was asleep and roaring Abel went away, she could sit for hours on the shaky back veranda steps, looking out over the barrens to the hills beyond, covered with their fine purple bloom, listening to the friendly wind singing wild, sweet melodies in the little spruces, and drinking in the aroma of the sunned grasses, until darkness flowed over the landscape like a cool, welcome wave. Sometimes of an afternoon, when Sissy was strong enough, the two girls went into the barrens and looked at the wood flowers. But they did not pick any. Valancy had read to Sissy the gospel thereof according to John Foster. It is a pity to gather wood flowers. They lose half their witchery away from the green and the flicker. The way to enjoy wood flowers is to track them down to their remote haunts, gloat over them, and then leave them with backward glances, taking with us only the beguiling memory of their grace and fragrance. Valancy was in the midst of realities after a lifetime of unrealities, and busy, very busy. The house had to be cleaned. Not for nothing had Valancy been brought up in the sterling habit of neatness and cleanliness. If she found satisfaction in cleaning dirty rooms, she got her fill of it here. Roaring Abel thought she was foolish to bother doing so much more than she was asked to do, but he did not interfere with her. He was very well satisfied with his bargain. Valancy was a good cook. Abel said she got a flavor into things. The only fault he found with her was that she did not sing at her work. Folks should always sing at their work, he insisted. Sounds cheerful like. Not always, retorted Valancy. Fancy a butcher singing at his work, or an undertaker. Abel burst into his great broad laugh. There's no getting the better of you. You've got an answer every time. I should think the Sterlings would be glad to get rid of you. They don't like being sassed back. During the day, Abel was generally away from home. If not working, then shooting or fishing with Barney Snaith. He generally came home at nights, always very late and often very drunk. The first night they heard him come howling into the yard. Sissy had told Valancy not to be afraid. Father never does anything. He just makes noise. Valancy, lying on the sofa in Sissy's room, where she had elected to sleep, lest Sissy should need attention in the night. Sissy would never have called her, was not at all afraid, and said so. By the time Abel had got his horses put away, the roaring stage had passed, and he was in his room at the end of the hall crying and praying. Valancy could still hear his dismal moans when she went calmly to sleep. For the most part, Abel was a good-natured creature, but occasionally he had a temper. Once Valancy asked him coolly, "What is the use of getting in a rage?" "It's such a damned relief," said Abel. They both burst out laughing together. "You're such a great little sport," said Abel admiringly. "Don't mind my bad French. I don't mean a thing by it, just habit. Say, I like a woman that ain't afraid to speak to me. Sis there was always too meek. That's why she got adrift. I like you." "All the same," said Valancy determinedly, "there's no use in sending things to hell, as you're always doing. And I'm not going to have you tracking mud all over a floor I've just scrubbed. You must use the scraper, whether you consign it to perdition or not." Sissy loved the cleanness and neatness. She had kept it so too until her strength failed. She was very pitifully happy because she had Valancy with her. It had been so terrible, long, lonely days and nights with no companionship save those dreadful old women who came to work. Sissy had hated and feared them. She clung to Valancy like a child. There was no doubt that Sissy was dying, yet at no time did she seem alarmingly ill. She did not even cough a great deal. Most days she was able to get up and dress, sometimes even to work about in the garden or the barrens for an hour or two. For a few weeks after Valancy's coming, she seemed so much better that Valancy began to hope she might get well. But Sissy shook her head. "No, I can't get well. My lungs are almost gone, and I don't want to. I'm so tired, Valancy. Only dying can rest me. But it's lovely to have you here. You'll never know how much it means to me. But Valancy, you work too hard. You don't need to. Father only wants his meals cooked. I don't think you are strong yourself. You turn pale sometimes. And those drops you take, are you well, dear?" "I'm all right," said Valancy lightly. She would not have Sissy worried. "And I'm not working hard. I'm glad to have some work to do, something that really wants to be done." "Then," Sissy slipped her hand wistfully into Valancy's, "don't let's talk any more about my being sick. Let's just forget it. Let's pretend I'm a little girl again, and you have come here to play with me. I used to wish that long ago, wish that you would come. I knew you couldn't, of course, but how I did wish it. You always seemed so different from the other girls, so kind and sweet, and as if you had something in yourself nobody knew about, some dear, pretty secret. Had you, Valancy?" "I had my blue castle," said Valancy, laughing a little. She was pleased that Sissy had thought of her like this. She had never suspected that anybody liked or admired or wondered about her. She told Sissy all about her blue castle. She had never told anyone about it before. "Everyone has a blue castle, I think," said Sissy softly. "Only everyone had a different name for it. I had mine once." She put her two thin hands over her face. She did not tell Valancy then who had destroyed her blue castle. But Valancy knew that whoever it was not Barney Snaith. End of chapter 17, read by Christine Rocker, February 20th, 2022, Westford, Massachusetts.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery, Chapter 18. Valancy was acquainted with Barney by now. Well acquainted, it seemed, though she had spoken to him only a few times. But then she had also felt just as well acquainted with him the first time they had met. She had been in the garden at twilight, hunting for a few stalks of white narcissus for Sissy's room, when she heard the terrible old Grace Lawson coming down through the woods from Miss Tawis. One could hear it miles away. Valancy did not look up as it drew near, thumping over the rocks in the crazy lane. She had never looked up, though Barney had gone racketing past every evening since she had been at Roaring Abel's. This time he did not racket past. The old Grace Lawson stopped with even more terrible noises than it made going. Valancy was conscious that Barney had sprung from it and was leaning over the ramshackle gate. She suddenly straightened up and looked into his face. Their eyes met. Valancy was suddenly conscious of the delicious weakness. Was one of her heart attacks coming on? But this was a new symptom. His eyes, which she had always thought brown, now seen close, were deep violet, translucent and intense. Neither of his eyebrows looked like the other. He was thin, too thin. She wished she could feed him up a bit. She wished she could sew the buttons on his coat and make him cut his hair and shave every day. There was something in his face. One hardly knew what it was. Tiredness, sadness, disillusionment. He had dimples in his thin cheeks when he smiled. All these thoughts flashed to Valancy's mind in one moment while his eyes looked into hers. "Good evening, Mrs. Sterling." Nothing could be more commonplace and conventional. Any one might have said it, but Barney Snaith had a way of saying things that gave them poignancy. When he said good evening, you felt that it was a good evening, and that it was partially his doing that it was. Also, you felt that some of the credit was yours. Valancy felt all this vaguely, but she couldn't imagine why she was trembling from head to foot. It must be her heart, if only he didn't notice. I'm going over to the port, Barney was saying. Can I acquire merit by getting or doing anything there for you, or Sissy? Will you get some salt codfish for us? Said Valancy. It was the only thing she could think of. Roaring Abel had expressed a desire that day for a dinner of boiled salt codfish. When her knights came running to the Blue Castle, Valancy had sent them on many a quest, but she never asked any of them to get her salt codfish. Certainly. You're sure there's nothing else? Lots of room in Lady Jane Grey's Lawson, and she always gets back sometime, does Lady Jane. I don't think there's any more, said Valancy. She knew he would bring oranges for Sissy anyhow. He always did. Barney did not turn away at once. He was silent for a little. Then he slowly and whimsically, Miss Sterling, you're a brick. You're a whole carload of bricks to come here and look for Sissy under the circumstances. There's nothing so bricky about that, said Valancy. I'd nothing else to do, and I like it here. I don't feel as though I've done anything specially meritorious. Mr. Gay is paying me fair wages. I've never earned any money before, and I like it. It seems so easy to talk to Barney Snaith some way. This terrible Barney Snaith of the lurid tales and mysterious past, as easy and natural as if talking to herself. All the money in the world couldn't buy what you're doing for Sissy Gay, said Barney. It's splendid and fine of you, and if there's anything I can help you in any way, you only have to let me know. If Roaring Abel ever tries to annoy you, he doesn't. He's lovely to me. I like Roaring Abel, said Valancy frankly. So do I, but there's one stage of his drunkenness, perhaps you haven't encountered it yet, when he sings ribald songs. Oh yes, he came home last night like that. Sissy and I just went to our room and shut ourselves in where we couldn't hear him. He apologized this morning. I'm not afraid of any Roaring Abel stages. Well, I'm sure he'll be decent to you, apart from his inebriated yows, said Barney. And I've told him he's got to stop damning things when you're around. Why? Asked Valancy slyly, with one of her odd slanting glasses, and a sudden flake of pink on each cheek, born of the thought that Barney Snaith had actually done so much for her. I've often feel like damning things myself. For a moment, Barney stared. Was this elfin girl the old little maidish creature who had stood there 2 minutes ago? Surely there was a magic and delvery going on in the shabby, weedy old garden. Then he laughed. It will be a relief to have someone to do it for you then. So you don't want anything but salt codfish? Not tonight, but I dare say I'll have some errands for you very often when you come to Port Lawrence. I can't trust Mr. Gay to remember to bring all the things I want. Barney had gone away then. In his garden, Lady Jane and Valancy stood in the garden for a long time. Since then, he had called several times, walking down through the barrens, whistling. How that whistle of his echoed through the spruces on those June twilights. Valancy caught herself listening for it every evening, rebuked herself, then let herself go. Why shouldn't she listen for it? He always brought Sissy fruit and flowers. Once he brought Valancy a box of candy, the first box of candy she had ever been given. It seemed sacrilege to eat it. She found herself thinking of him in season and out of season. She wanted to know if he ever thought about her when she wasn't before his eyes, and if so, what? She wanted to see the mysterious house of his back on Mistawis Island. Sissy had never seen it. Sissy, though she talked freely of Barney and had known him for 5 years, really knew little more of him than Valancy herself. But he isn't bad, said Sissy. Nobody need ever tell me he is. He can't have done a thing he's to be ashamed of. Then why does he live as he does? Asked Valancy, to hear somebody defend him. I don't know. He's a mystery, and of course there's something behind it, but I know it isn't a disgrace. Barney Snaith simply couldn't do anything disgraceful, Valancy. Valancy was not so sure. Barney must have done something. Sometime. He was a man of education and intelligence. She soon discovered that, and is listening to his conversation and wrangles with Roaring Abel, who was surprisingly well read and could discuss any subject under the sun when somber. Such a man wouldn't bury himself for 5 years in Muskoka and live and look like a tramp if there were not too good or too bad a reason for it. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she was sure now that she had never been Sissy Gay's lover. There was nothing like that between them. though he's very fond of Sissy and she of him, as anyone could see, but it was a fondness that didn't worry Valancy. "You don't know what Barney has been to me these past 2 years," Sissy had said simply. "Everything would have been unbearable without him. Sissy Gay's the sweetest girl I've ever knew, and if there's a man somewhere, I'd like to shoot if I could find him," Barney had said savagely. Barney was an interesting talker, with a knack of telling a great deal about his adventures and nothing at all about himself. There was one gloriously rainy day when Barney and Abel swapped yarns all afternoon while Valancy mended the tablecloths and listened. Barney told weird tales of his adventures with shacks on trains while hoboing it across the continent. Valancy thought she ought to think his stealing rights quite dreadful, but didn't. The story of his working his way to England on a cattle ship sounded more legitimate, and his yarns of Yukon enthralled her, especially the one of the night where he was lost on the divide between the Gold Run and Sulphur Valley. He had spent 2 years out there. Where in all this was there room for the penitentiary and the other things? If he were telling the truth, but Valancy already knew he was. "Found no gold," he said. "Came away poorer than I went, but such a place to live. Those silences at the back of the north wind got me. I've never belonged to myself since." Yet he was not a great talker. He told a great deal in few well-chosen words. How well-chosen Valancy did not realize, and he had a knack of saying things without opening his mouth at all. "I like a man whose eyes say more than his lips," thought Valancy. But then she liked everything about him, his tawny hair, his whimsical smiles, the little glints of fun in his eyes, his loyal affection for the unspeakable Lady Jane, his habit of sitting with his hands in his pockets, his chin sunk on his breast, looking up from his mismatted eyebrows. She liked his nice voice, which sounded as if it might become caressing or wooing with very little provocation. She was at times almost afraid to let herself think these thoughts. They were so vivid that she felt as if others must know what she was thinking. "I've been watching a woodpecker all day," he said one evening on a shaky old back veranda. His account of the woodpecker's doing was satisfying. He had some gay or cunning little anecdote of the woodfolk to tell them. And sometimes he and Roaring Abel smoked fiercely the whole evening and never said a word, while Sissy lay in the hammock swung between them and the veranda posts, and Valancy sat idly on the steps, her hands clasped over her knees, and wondered dreamily if she really were Valancy Sterling, and if it were only 3 weeks since she had left the ugly old house in Elm Street. The barrens lay before her in a white moon splendor, where dozens of little rabbits frisked. Barney, when he liked, could sit down at the edge of the barrens and lure those rabbits right to him by some mysterious sorcerer he possessed. Valancy had once seen a squirrel leap from a scrub pine to his shoulder and sit there chattering to him. It reminded her of John Foster. It was one of those delights of Valancy's new life that she could read John Foster's books as often and as long as she wanted to. She read them all to Sissy, who loved them. She tried to also read them to Abel and Barney, who did not love them. Abel was bored, and Barney politely refused to listen at all. "Piffle," said Barney. End of chapter 18.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 19. Of course, the Sterlings had not left the poor maniac alone all this time or refrained from heroic efforts to rescue her perishing soul and reputation. Uncle James, his lawyer, had helped him as little as his doctor, came one day, and finding Valancy alone in the kitchen, as he supposed, gave her a terrible talking to, told her she was breaking her mother's heart and disgracing her family. "But why?" said Valancy, not ceasing to score her porridge pot decently. "I'm doing honest work for honest pay. What is there in it that is disgraceful?" "Don't quibble, Valancy," said Uncle James solemnly. "This is no fit place for you to be, and you know it. Why, I'm told that your jailbird Snaith is hanging around here every evening." "Not every evening," said Valancy reflectively. "No, not quite every evening." It's insufferable," said Uncle James violently. "Valancy, you must come home. We won't judge you harshly. I assure you we won't. We will overlook all this." "Thank you," Valancy said. "Have you no sense of shame?" demanded Uncle James. "Oh, yes, but the things I am ashamed are not the things you are ashamed of." Valancy proceeded to rinse her dishcloths meticulously. Still, Uncle James was patient. He gripped the sides of his chair and ground his teeth. We know your mind isn't just right. We'll make allowances, but you must come home. You shall not stay here with that drunken, blasphemous old scoundrel." "Were you by chance referring to me, Mr. Sterling?" demanded roaring Abel, suddenly appearing in the doorway of the veranda where he had been smoking a peaceful pipe and listening to old Jim Sterling's tirade with huge enjoyment. His red beard fairly bristled with indignation and his huge eyebrows quivered, but cowardice was not among James Sterling's shortcomings. "I was, and furthermore I want to tell you that you have acted an iniquitous part in luring this weak and unfortunate girl away from her home and friends. I will have you punished yet for it." James Sterling's got no further. Roaring Abel crossed the kitchen at a bound, caught him by the collar in his trousers, and hurled him through the doorway and over the garden paling with as little apparent effort as he might have employed in whisking away a troublesome kitten out of the way. "The next time you come back here," he bellowed, "I'll throw you through the window, and all the better if the window is shut. Coming here thinking yourself got to put the worlds to rights." Valancy candidly and unashamedly owned to herself that she had seen a few more satisfying sights than Uncle James's coattails flying out of the asparagus bed. She had once been afraid of this man's judgment. Now she saw clearly he was nothing but a rather stupid little village tin god. Roaring Abel turned with his great broad laugh. "He'll think of that for years when he wakes up in the night. The Almighty made a mistake in making so many Sterlings, but since they are made, we've got to reckon with them. Too many to kill out. But if they come here bothering you, I'll shoo him off before a cat could lick its ear." The next time they sent Dr. Stalling, surely Roaring Abel would not throw him into the asparagus bed. Dr. Stalling was not so sure of this and had no great liking for the task. He did not believe Valancy Sterling was out of her mind. She had always been queer. She was only just a little queerer than usual. Dr. Stalling has his own reasons for disliking Roaring Abel. When Dr. Stalling had first come to Deerwood, he had a liking for long hikes around Miswatis and Muskokoa. On one of those occasions he had got lost, and after much wandering had fallen into Roaring Abel with his gun over his shoulder. Dr. Stalling had contrived to ask his question about the most idiotic manner possible. He said, "Can you tell me where I'm going?" "How the devil should I know where you're going, Gosling?" retorted Abel contemptuously. Dr. Stalling was so enraged that he could not speak for a moment or two, and in that moment Abel had disappeared in the woods. Dr. Stalling had eventually found his way home, but he had never hankered to encounter Abel Gay again. Nevertheless, he now came to do his duty. Valancy greeted him with a sinking heart. She had to own herself that she was terribly afraid of Dr. Stalling still. She had a miserable conviction that if he shook his long, bony finger at her and told her to go home, she dared not disobey. "Mr. Gay," said Dr. Stalling politely and condescendingly, "may I see Miss Sterling alone for a few minutes?" Roaring Abel was a little drunk, just drunk enough to be excessively polite and very cunning. He had been on the point of going away when Dr. Stalling arrived, but now he sat in the corner of the parlor and folded his arms. "No, mister," he said solemnly, "that wouldn't do at all. I've got the reputation of my household to keep up. I've got to chaperone this long lady. Can't have any sparking going on here behind my back." Outraged Dr. Stalling looked so terrible that Valancy wondered how Abel could endure this aspect. But Abel was not worried at all. "I know nothing about it anyway," he asked genially. "About what? Sparking," said Abel coolly. Poor Dr. Stalling, who had never been married because he believed in a celibate clergy, would not notice this ribald remark. He turned his back on Abel and addressed himself to Valancy. "Miss Sterling, I am here in response to your mother's wishes. She begged me to come. I am charged with some messages from her. Will you," he wagged his finger, "will you hear him?" "Yes," said Valancy faintly, eyeing the forefinger. It had been a hypnotic effect on her. "This first is this. If you will leave this house," interjected Roaring Abel, "House. Troubled with impediment your speech, ain't you, mister? This place, and return to your home. Mr. James Sterling will himself pay a good nurse to come here and wait on Miss Gay." Back of her chair, Valancy smiled in secret. Uncle James must indeed regard the matter as desperate when he would loosen his purse strings like that. At any rate, her claims no longer despised her or ignored her. She had become important to them. That's my business, mister, said Abel. Miss Sterling can go if she pleases or stay if she pleases. I made a fair bargain with her. She's free to conclude it when she likes. She gives me my meals that stick to my ribs. She don't forget to put salt in the porridge. She never slams doors, and when she has nothing to say, she don't talk. That's uncanny in a woman, you know, mister. I'm satisfied. If she isn't, she's free to go. But no woman comes in here in James Sterling's pay. If anyone does, Abel's voice was uncannily bland and polite, I'll splatter the road with her brains. Tell him that A. Gay's compliments. Dr. Stalling, a nurse is not what Sissy needs, said Valancy earnestly. She isn't so ill as that yet. What she wants is companionship, somebody she knows and likes just to live with her. You can understand that, I'm sure. I understand that your motive is quite commendable. Dr. Stalling felt that he was broad-minded indeed, especially as his secret soul he did not believe Valancy's motive was commendable. He had the least idea what she was up to, but he was sure her motive was not commendable. When he could not understand a thing, he straightway condemned it, simplicity itself. But your first duty is to your mother. She needs you. She implores you to come home. She will forgive everything if you only come home. That's a pretty little thought, remarked Abel meditatively as he ground some tobacco up in his hand. Dr. Stalling ignored him. She entreats, but I, Miss Sterling, Dr. Stalling remembered that he was an ambassador of Jehovah. I command, as your pastor and spiritual guide, I command you to come home with me this very day. Get your hat and coat and come now. Dr. Stalling shook his finger at Valancy. Before that pitiless finger she drooped and wilted visibly. She's giving in, thought rowing Abel. She'll go with him. Beats all the power these preachers fellows have over women. Valancy was on the point of obeying Dr. Stalling. She must go home with him and give up. She would last back to Doss Sterling again, and for her few remaining days or weeks be the cowed, futile creature that she had always been. It was her fate. Typified with the relentless uplifted forefinger, she could no longer escape from it than rowing Abel from his predestination. She eyed it as fascinated bird eyes the snake. Another moment. Fear is the original sin, suddenly said a small voice back of Valancy's consciousness. Almost all the evil in the world has its origin in the fact that someone is afraid of something. Valancy stood up. She was still in the clutches of fear, but her soul was her own again. She would not be false to that inner voice. Dr. Stalling, she said slowly, I do not at present owe any duty to my mother. She is quite well. She has all the assistance and companionship she requires. She does not need me at all. I am needed here. I'm going to stay here. There's spunk for you, said rowing Abel admiringly. Dr. Stalling dropped his forefinger. One could have not keep on shaking a finger forever. Miss Sterling, is there nothing that can influence you?
Do you remember your childhood days? Perfectly, and I hate them.
Do you realize what people will say, what they are saying? I can imagine it, said Valancy with a shrug of her shoulders. She was suddenly free of fear again. I haven't listened to the gossip of Deerwood tea parties and sewing circles 20 years for nothing. But Dr. Stalling, it doesn't matter in the least to me what they say. Not in the least. Dr. Stalling went away. A girl who cared nothing for public opinion, over whom sacred family ties had no restraining influence, who hated her childhood memories. Then Cousin Georgiana came, on her own initiative, for nobody would have thought it would be worthwhile to send her. She found Valancy alone, weeding the little vegetable garden she had planted, and made all the platitudious pleas she could think of. Valancy heard her patiently. Cousin Georgiana wasn't such a bad soul after all. Then she said, And now that you have got all that out of your system, Cousin Georgiana, can you tell me how to make creamed codfish so that it will not be as thick as porridge and as salt as the Dead Sea? We'll just have to wait, said Uncle Benjamin. After all, Sissy Gate can't live long. Dr. Marsh tells me she may drop off any day. Mrs. Frederick wept. It would really have been so much easier to bear if Valancy had died. She could have worn mourning then. End of chapter 19.